Hey everyone, and welcome to another edition of CLPL's Adult Storytime, Storytime for Adults. I'm your host, Katie from Adult Services, and we are on our second January Storytime, where we're going to explore a new, maybe new to you genre, because that's what we're doing in January. We're trying out some new genres for the new year. And this week we are trying out fantasy. Now, fantasy is another one of my favorite genres. I was basically raised on a steady diet of sci-fi and fantasy. Lord of the Rings, Arthur C. Clarke, all the classics, Ray Bradbury. But today I'm going to bring you some more modern classics, and in particular, A Winter's Promise by Christelle Dabos. This is part of the Mirror Quartet, of which I've only read one book, and that is this one. Thoroughly enjoyed it. This is a book that was originally written in French and translated, and I believe, let me see, it came out in the US in 2018. So let's get started. This is set in a fantastical world, and we follow our main character, whose name is Ophelia, through an incredible journey of self-discovery. Ophelia is from a magical world. The world is kind of fragmented, as things usually seem to go in fantasy worlds, and she is from a part of the world called Anima, where people can do kind of magical things with their hands, and her magic is being able to read objects. She can read the history of an object by touching it. So we're just going to start with an excerpt from chapter 1 that sets up Ophelia's journey and her story. So here we go. This is A Winter's Promise from The Mirror Visitor, Book 1 by Christelle Dabos. And you'll find this on Hoopla. If you are interested after you hear it, you can check it out right away. All right. Chapter 1, The Archivist. It's often said of old buildings that they have a soul. On Anima, the ark where objects come to life, old buildings tend mostly to become appallingly bad-tempered. The family archives building, for example, was forever in a foul mood. It spent its days cracking, creaking, dripping, and puffing to express its disgruntlement. It didn't like the drafts that made doors, left ajar, slam in the summer. It didn't like the rains that clogged up its gutters in the autumn. It didn't like the damp that seeped into its walls in winter. It didn't like the weeds that returned to invade its courtyard every spring. But above all, the archives building didn't like visitors who didn't stick to the opening hours. And that's doubtless why, in the early hours of that September morning, the building was cracking, creaking, dripping, and puffing even more than usual. It sensed someone arriving when it was still far too early to consult the archives. And that particular visitor didn't even stand at the front door on the steps like a respectable visitor. No, that visitor entered the archives building like a thief, straight from the cloakroom. A nose was sprouting, right in the middle of a mirrored wardrobe. The nose kept coming. Soon after, a pair of glasses emerged, then the arch of an eyebrow, a forehead, a mouth, a chin, cheeks, eyes, hair, a neck, and ears. Suspended there above the shoulders, in the center of the mirror, the face looked to the right and then to the left. Next, a bit further down, a bended knee poked through, and in tow came a body that pulled itself right out of the mirrored wardrobe, as if from a bathtub. Once clear of the mirror, the figure amounted to nothing more than a worn-out old coat, a pair of gray-tinted glasses, and a long three-colored scarf. And under these thick layers, there was Ophelia. All around Ophelia, the cloakroom was now protesting from its every wardrobe, furious at this intrusion that flouted the archive's rules. The pieces of furniture creaked at the hinges and stamped their feet. The hangers clanged noisily, one against the other, as though propelled by a poltergeist. This display of anger didn't intimidate Ophelia in the slightest. She was used to the archives being temperamental. "Gently does it," she murmured. "Gently does it." Instantly the furniture calmed down and the hangers fell silent. The archives building had recognized her. Ophelia went out of the cloakroom and closed the door. On the panel was written, "Beware! Cold rooms! Take a coat!" With hands in pockets and long scarf trailing, Ophelia passed a succession of labeled filing cabinets. Register of births, register of deaths, register of consanguinity exemptions, and so on. She gently opened the door of the consulting room. Not a soul. The shutters were closed, but they let in a few rays of sun that lit up a row of desks in the gloom. The singing of a blackbird from the garden seemed to make this burst of light even more luminous. It was so cold in the archives, you felt like opening all the windows to usher in the warm air outside. Ophelia stood still for a moment in the doorway. She watched the threads of sunlight slide slowly across the floorboards as the day broke. She inhaled deeply the scent of old furniture and cold paper, that aroma in which Ophelia's childhood had been steeped. Soon she would smell it no longer. With slow steps, she made her way towards the archivist's quarters. All that shielded the private apartment was a curtain. Despite the early hour, a strong smell of coffee was already wafting through. Ophelia coughed into her scarf to make her presence known, but an old operatic aria drowned it out. So she slipped around the curtain. She didn't have to search for the archivist, as the room served simultaneously as kitchen, living room, bedroom, and reading room. There he was, sitting on his bed, nose in a periodical. He was an old man with untamed white hair. He wedged a lobe under his eyebrow, making that eye look enormous. He wore gloves and under his jacket a badly ironed white shirt. Ophelia coughed again, but he didn't hear it due to the gramophone. Engrossed in his reading, he sang along to the little aria, somewhat out of tune, in fact. And then there was the humming of the coffee pot, the rumbling of the stove, and all the usual little noises of the archives building. Ophelia soaked up the particular atmosphere pervading these quarters. The off-key singing of the old man, the waxing light of day filtering through the curtains, the rustling of carefully turned pages, the smell of coffee, and underlying it, the naphtha whiff of a gas lamp. In one corner of the room, there was a draft board on which the pieces moved of their own accord, as though two invisible players were taking each other on. It made Ophelia want, above all, to touch nothing, to leave things just as they were, to turn right back for fear of spoiling this familiar scene. And yet she had to steel herself to break the spell. She approached the bed and tapped on the archivist's shoulder. "Lordy!" he exclaimed, jumping out of his skin. "Couldn't you warn people before springing on them like that?" "I did try to," said Ophelia apologetically. She picked up the loop that had rolled onto the carpet and handed it back to him. Then she took off the coat that engulfed her from top to toe, unwound her endless scarf, and placed the lot over the back of a chair. All that remained of her was a slight figure, untidy, thick brown curls, 2 rectangles for glasses, and an outfit more suited to an elderly lady. "You've come straight from the cloakroom again, huh?" growled the archivist, wiping his loop clean with his sleeve. "This obsession with traveling through mirrors at ungodly hours. You know very well my little abode is allergic to surprise visits. One of these days you're going to get whacked on the head and you'll have asked for it." His gruff voice made his splendid mustache, which reached his ears, quiver. He got up from his bed with difficulty and seized the coffee pot, muttering in a dialect that he was the last to speak on anima. With all his handling of archives, the old man lived entirely in the past. Even the periodical he was leafing through dated back at least half a century. "A mug of coffee, dear girl?" The archivist wasn't a very sociable man, but whenever he set eyes on Ophelia, as now, those eyes began to sparkle like cider. He'd always had a soft spot for his great niece, doubtless because, of all the family, she was the one who most resembled him. Just as old-fashioned, just as solitary, just as reserved. Ophelia nodded. She had too much of a lump in her throat to speak right then, right there. Her great-uncle poured out a steaming cup for each of them. "I was on the phone with your ma yesterday evening," he chomped into his mustache. So excited she was, I couldn't grasp half of her jabbering. But still, I got the gist. You're finally taking the plunge, it seems. Ophelia confirmed this without saying a word. Her great-uncle promptly knitted his huge brows. Oh, don't pull that long face, please. Your mother's found you a chap, and that's the end of it. He handed her cup to her and sat back heavily on his bed, making every spring creak. Park yourself down. We need a serious chat, godfather to goddaughter. Ophelia pulled a chair over to the bed. She stared at her great-uncle and his magnificent mustache with a sense of unreality. She felt as though, through him, she were watching a page of her life being torn out, right under her nose. I can well imagine why you're eyeballing me like that, he said, except that this time the answer's no. Those sloping shoulders of yours, those gloomy glasses, and those sighs of total despair, you can just pack them all away. He was gesturing with thumb and forefinger, both bristled with white hairs. There's those 2 cousins you've already rejected. Granted, they were ugly as peppermills and gross as chamber pots, but it was the whole family you were insulting with each rejection. And what's worse, I made myself your accomplice in sabotaging those betrothals. He sighed into his mustache. I know you as if I'd made you. You're more accommodating than a chest of drawers, never raising your voice, never throwing tantrums, but the minute anyone mentions a husband, you send more sparks flying than an anvil. And yet you're the right age for it, whether the chap's your type or not. If you don't settle down, you'll end up banished from the family, and that I'm not having. Ophelia, her nose in a cup of coffee, decided that it was high time she spoke up. You've got nothing to worry about, Uncle. I didn't come here to ask you to oppose this marriage. At that moment, the needle of the gramophone got stuck in a scratch. The endless echo of the soprano filled the room. If I. The great-uncle didn't get up to free the needle from its groove. He was too flabbergasted. What are you babbling to me? You don't want me to intervene? No. The only favor I've come to ask you today is to have access to the archives. My archives? Today. If I, the record player stuttered on. Fiddling with his mustache, the great-uncle raised a skeptical eyebrow. You're not expecting me to plead your case to your mother? It wouldn't do any good. Nor to bring your feeble father round? I'm going to marry the man that's been chosen for me. It's as simple as that. The gramophone needle suddenly jumped and then carried on where it had left off, with the soprano proclaiming triumphantly, If I love you, look out for yourself. Ophelia pushed up the glasses on her nose and held her godfather's gaze without blinking. Her eyes were as brown as his were golden. Splendid, said the old man, breathing a sigh of relief. I must admit, I thought you were incapable of uttering those words. He must have really taken your fancy, that fellow. Spill the beans and tell me who he is. Ophelia rose from her chair to clear away their cups. She wanted to rinse them, but the sink was already full to the brim with dirty plates. Normally, Ophelia didn't like housework, but this morning she unbuttoned her gloves, rolled up her sleeves, and did the washing up. You don't know him, she said at last. Her muttering was drowned by the sound of running water. The great-uncle stopped the gramophone and went closer to the sink. I couldn't hear you, dear girl. Ophelia turned the tap off for a moment. Her voice was quiet and her diction poor, so she often had to repeat what she'd said. You don't know him. You're forgetting whom you're talking to, sniggered the great-uncle, crossing his arms. My nose may never be out of my archives, but I know the family tree better than anyone. There's not one of your most distant cousins from the valley to the Great Lakes that I don't know about. You don't know him, insisted Ophelia. She wiped a plate with her sponge while staring into space. Touching all these dishes without protective gloves had sent her back in time. She could have described, down to the smallest detail, everything her great-uncle had eaten off these plates since he'd first owned them. Usually, being very professional, Ophelia never handled objects belonging to others without her gloves on, but her great-uncle had taught her to read right here, in this flat. She knew each utensil personally, inside out. This man isn't part of the family, she finally announced. He's from the pole. I'm going to leave it right there because that is the inciting event that kicks off this entire story, pulling Ophelia away from the only home she's ever known in Anima to the pole, with a strange and seemingly cold man who is her betrothed. Why are they betrothed? Why does he need to take her all the way to the pole? What is his life like, and what are the people like on the pole? They're very different than the people on Anima, which Ophelia finds out very quickly. And I found it to be quite epic, fast moving. Once we got through the beginning of the betrothal, Ophelia really doesn't want to marry this man. She makes it quite clear. But we all know, reading the book, that somehow she is going to end up at the pole, and we need to figure out why. So once we get there, things move at a clip, and it is a very, very interesting book, full of, what would I say, empowerment, growth. Ophelia can really only rely on herself and the amazing talents that she knows she has, and maybe some she doesn't know she has. So I thought it was a great read. I suppose it would be classified under young adult, but I wouldn't limit myself, and I wouldn't say for you to limit yourself in not reading it because it might be classified as young adult, because she is a protagonist about 17, 18 years old. So definitely, if you like fantasy, or if that intrigued you at all, definitely worth checking out. And again, that's available on Hoopla right now. That's an app you can put on your phone or your e-readers and tablets. So easy. Go to your app store, download Hoopla, and put your library card number in, and you'll get started right away finding lots of exciting books. Now, I wanted to show you some of my other favorite fantasy books, give you a kind of a broad spectrum of at least what I like to read, so you can get the idea that fantasy isn't all about magic and horses and castles, and of course that, you know, that's a big part of it, but fantasy is so much more. And I think some people limit it to, you know, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and The Hobbit, and maybe Harry Potter, and they kind of stop there, but there's so much more to it. So, I say a few, I have like 6 books here, but I'm going to show you a few. This is one of my favorite books that I read in the past few years, A Million Junes by Emily Henry. A beautiful book about memory, kind of, what's the word, magical realism. So they live in it and live in the real world, but magical, ghostly, spirity things are happening. A really beautiful story about loss and love. Here's more of, I think some people might think of this as, you know, their kind of classic fantasy. We have here Harry Dresden, the wizard paranormal investigator, set in Chicago, which makes it super fun because there's lots of landmarks. This is a series that starts with the book Stormfront and keeps going. He, I think, just released, oh gosh, I couldn't tell you the number, but we're in the teens at the very least. So there's quite a few in this series. Very fun, kind of that classic magical spells, monsters, demons, magical animals, all sorts of fun stuff, and definitely really great. So Jim Butcher, the Dresden Files. The first one is Stormfront. This is a book I recently finished, absolutely adored. You may have heard of it. The House in the Cerulean Sea was on a lot of must-read lists last year for 2020. Absolutely 100% recommended. It was a gorgeous, beautiful, sweet, funny, magical book. And it's about magical children and the kind of government oversight that in this world seems to be required of schools and orphanages for magical children. So I guess think maybe a tiny bit X-Men, a tiny bit Wayward, the Wayward Children series by Shawneen McGuire, maybe a little bit Harry Potter in the sense of the vividness of each character and their personality, and the humor, but it really stands on its own as a wonderful, sweet, affirming book about kindness and doing the right thing, and and loving people for who they are, and not, not what we might think they are. So I thought it was really wonderful, sweet, and also LGBT romance, which I thought was so well done. So definitely, this is House on the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. Here's another one I read recently. If you remember Jonathan Norrell and Mr. Strange by Susanna Clark, that's another great fantasy, epic, long, huge, wonderful read if you're in the mood for an epic. Now, this is one of her newest books. This just came out very recently, Piranesi. And as you can see, if you've read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, you know that that book is more like this big. This one's a little bit smaller, easier to digest in smaller doses. And it's a wonderful fantasy kind of set in a dream world where ideas and former, not popular is the wrong word, but the formerly big ideas of the day kind of go when they fall out of fashion, and who lives in this place and why does it exist. I thought it was quite beautifully done. And then the last one I'll show you is another classified as YA, the Raven Boys series by Maggie Stiefvater, and really lovely work there as well. 4 books in this series, and it follows a group of 4 boys at a boarding school and a girl that becomes their friend. She lives in the town. Her mother and her mother's friends, roommates, they all have psychic abilities, and our protagonist Blue does not, but she can connect with people in ways that she doesn't realize yet. And then these 4 boys that she meets, and what meeting them means, and what they discover about where they live. I thought it was so magical, wonderfully done. Maggie Stiefvater also continued the series, one of the characters and a power that he possesses, in her newest book, Call Down the Hawk. So if you've read The Raven Boys, you didn't know that she continued a couple stories of some of the boys in Call Down the Hawk. Definitely worth looking up there. And one more, I just can't help myself. This was a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, and that can be a little controversial to some, I think, because of the nature of the story, which is that basically our protagonist is held captive, and what does that mean? How does that affect the relationship she forms, and that is formed with her from her captor, and what his story is. But I thought the protagonist in this book was wonderful. She is an amazing archer. I thought that was really cool. And I love a story about a girl that fights for her family, a woman that fights for her family. So that's Hunted by Megan Spooner. And that's just like the smallest smattering. Some of them would qualify as high fantasy. Some of them, and that means, lots of spells, lots of other languages, lots of magic and world building. And sometimes you're dropped into a world that is just so unfamiliar, and there's all these new rules. And then some of them are a little more gentle, like A Million Junes, and they're more, you feel more like it's a world that you could conceivably come from as well, but with the magic sprinkled on top. And that's what fantasy is, just exploring those other worlds and those other possibilities. So I hope that you got some ideas today of maybe some fantasy titles that you want to try and check out for yourself. And I can't wait to see you next time for I'm going to talk about mysteries and some favorite mysteries. You might see a few behind me, but I'll talk about one in particular that I'll read an excerpt from that I thought was fun because it's set in a library. So thank you again for joining me. I hope you're all doing well and staying safe and healthy. And we will be seeing each other again soon. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.